So looting is one of the most important parts of any Diablo game, but with that comes a heavy amount of RNG. But Diablo 4 has a handful of systems to try to help tackle this issue, and that's what I want to go over in this video. And in Diablo 4, there's actually going to be quite a lot of systems that allow you to target farm different pieces of loot you're looking for. And a good place to start is the gambling systems. And these two gambling vendors work in basically the same way. They're going to sell randomized gear for every single slot in the game. They're just going to take different resources. The first one taking Murmuring Obols, which are the currency you get for completing any events in the open world and from completing any random events that occur while you're in a dungeon. And you unlock this very early on in the game, so this can also be very helpful for gearing up while you're leveling up and getting through the main campaign. But it's still going to be very good once you get into the end game and you're looking for better pieces of gear for specific slots. It also seems like it's going to be pretty decent for just obtaining a lot of legendaries very quickly, because you can just buy the cheapest piece from the vendor and have a lot more chances to get legendary items to try to get the legendary aspect you want to put it on whatever gear you want. And the second vendor is going to be basically the same thing, just PvP specific. So you go in the Fields of Hatred, which is the Diablo 4 PvP system, you obtain the new currency that is found within these areas, and then you can use that on a vendor very similar to the Murmuring Obols vendor. You're just using this PvP specific currency, and you can spend it on a randomized piece of gear for every slot as well. And it has been confirmed that you will be able to get every gear rarity from these gambling vendors. You won't be able to get all unique items from these vendors. So some unique items, probably more rare ones or ones that are deemed to be a bit more powerful, won't be able to be obtained from these gambling vendors. And I think the reason for this is they don't want you to just be able to mindlessly grind open world event resources and just get any unique in the game. They probably want some of these more rare chase items to only be obtained from specific harder content. And next we have the Tree of Whispers and Whispers of the Dead system. Now this is an endgame specific system that you unlock once you get into World Tier 3, which you have to complete the main campaign and complete the first capstone dungeon to unlock. Now once you unlock this system, it's going to fill up the world of Diablo 4 with objectives to complete. It's basically the bounty system of Diablo 4, and these are going to be rotating objectives that rotate a handful of times every day, and they're going to give different random amounts of loot, so you can target farm a little bit for different things you're looking for, if you're looking for more gold or more XP or specific types of loot. But one of the main things you're doing this for are Grim Favors, which you get for completing any of these objectives. Now once you get 10 Grim Favors, you take them to the Tree of Whispers that's going to give you your reward. And you're going to be able to choose a cache of loot that gives you a specific item slot of pieces of loot. So maybe a gauntlet cache or a leg cache or a two-handed weapon cache. So the primary loot you're going to be getting is whatever cache you're going for, and you're also going to get some nightmare sigils and some other loot on top of that. But this is going to be one of the first ways where you can really start to target farm specific slots of loot once you get into the end game. And in a similar vein, we have Helltides, which is another end game system that you only unlock once you get into World Tier 3. And this is going to cause one of the regions of the game to be taken over by Lilith and her armies. And once you go in this region and do basically anything, you're going to start getting a new currency called Cinders. So completing events, killing bosses, or just killing any enemies in this area will give you this new currency. Now these Cinders are able to be used on Helltide caches that you find scattered throughout the region when a Helltide is active. And these chests are actually going to give you a specific slot of loot, and they're going to be randomized, so you actually have to find the chest you want to get the type of loot you're actually looking for. So one chest would have boots on it, one chest would have helmets on it. So when you open that chest, you're primarily going to be getting those slots that chest is labeled as. So in a very similar vein to the caches you're getting from the Tree of Whispers, you're able to target farm specific slots of loot in these Helltides, and this is going to be a very good way to start off your builds into the end endgame. And with how much they're allowing us to target farm specific loot in the base game of Diablo 4, I have a hunch that systems coming with future seasons are also going to be implementing ways to target farm new loot, and potentially having new ways to target farm all loot being implemented into these new seasons and new systems. It seems like this is something that the developers are very much aware of, so they want to allow players to continue to have ways to target farm the loot they're looking for, so they're not 100% beholden to RNG. And this hasn't been 100% confirmed, but presumably there's going to be different bosses or different hard activities in the game that also can drop specific pieces of loot. That's been a part of pretty much every other Diablo game in the past, so I would fully expect there's going to be different bosses or different world bosses, or maybe even specific dungeons that have a much higher chance to drop some specific pieces of loot, possibly different bosses that you have to go kill that boss to get something like a specific unique item. There's actually a type of targeted farming that's more foundational in a game. And the basis of this is that specific enemies or specific enemy types or factions are actually going to drop pieces of loot more often than other pieces of loot. And one of the examples the developers gave of this is that skeletons would have a higher chance to drop crossbows. So that means if you want to farm for some specific crossbow you're looking for, you may want to do a dungeon that's mostly filled with skeletons, or go to some area that you know there's a lot of skeletons at. Now, it sounds like this isn't going to be some ridiculously increased chance to drop just crossbows, but this increase mixed with an area that's already good at farming loot in general could end up making a pretty big difference in giving you loot you're actually looking for. And in Diablo 4, all the different monsters of the game are split up into different monster families, so certain areas are only going to be able to have certain monster families, and certain dungeons can only have certain monster families as well. And presumably these monster families are what are going to drop different pieces of loot more often than others, meaning choosing where you go farm is actually going to have a pretty big impact on getting the loot you're actually looking for. And the developers have talked about in the past that dungeons could also have some type of effect like this, where one dungeon may drop helmets more than other dungeons, or that this dungeon may drop a specific type of loot more often. Now, we haven't heard anything about that very recently, and there wasn't any in-game information in the betas that would point towards this, so I'm assuming that the increased drop rates for certain loot from these monster families is what is actually going to dictate that, instead of a specific dungeon itself having this increased chance to drop specific loot. Now, even though this isn't directly tied into looting, I think the Codex of Power system also plays a pretty big part in reducing the amount of RNG in Diablo 4 and allows you to create your builds much more easily. Now, the Codex of Power is essentially a permanent unlock system for legendary aspects. So you complete a dungeon and it unlocks you the Codex of Power that's tied to that dungeon, which permanently unlocks you a legendary aspect that can be applied to as many pieces of gear as you want. The biggest downsides of this system being you can't get every legendary power from the Codex, and the Codex always gives you the lowest rolled version of these powers. But just like a lot of these targeted loot farms, you're able to know what dungeon you have to go complete to get that Codex of Power to unlock that legendary aspect, so you can very specifically target the powers you're looking for to start off your build or get some of the last pieces of the build you're putting together. And I think this is going to play a very similar role to a lot of these targeted loot farms. So the base of Diablo 4 is shaping up to give you a lot more options on target farming specific pieces of loot than many other ARPGs. It usually takes years and years for a lot of other games in the genre to allow you to target specific pieces of loot or do different pieces of content that gives you different loot. And starting off with a base that allows so many different ways of doing this, I would only expect this to get even better over time. So if you're somebody that's afraid of there being too much RNG in a game like this, I think Diablo 4 is going to have a really good mix of RNG and target farmed loot. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.